everybody, and welcome back to this tutorial. And this is the first tutorial where we'll actually start to code our reverse shell and our server that will accept all of the connections to our Kali Linux machine. So first of all, let us start off with the server, since the socket code for the server is a little bit bigger and more complicated than the actual socket code for the reverse shell. In server there are multiple functions that we need to execute in order to perform the entire connection, while in the reverse shell we will only need to perform the connect function after creating the socket object. So let us navigate to our Python programs, so root Python programs. We can call this mkdir, we can call it reverse_shell. That will be the name of our actual directory where we will save our reverse shell and server and any additional actual programs that we need for this section. So let us first of all nano server.py, just a simple name, we don't need anything to specify else, so just right here add the additional line user bin python, and we know that we are going to use the socket library as the first library in order to create the connection. So first of all, let us just try to create the connecting of these two programs from two different machines. Now for those of you who are coming from my previous ethical hacking course already know how we are going to do this. So if you already watched this in my ethical hacking course, feel free to skip to the end of this section where we will actually change some different things and compile the program in a different way in order to see what our available options are for running this attack. But for those of you that are watching this for the first time, let us continue. So what we want to do first is to create the socket object. So we will store it in a variable that we will call simply just s. In order to create socket object we are already familiar with, we need to run the socket.socket function, and in these brackets right here we need to specify what type of socket object we want to create. So we will paste two arguments right here. One of them is socket.af_inet, which will allow us to create a socket object for the IPv4 address, since we are going to perform the connection function onto the IPv4 address on a certain port. Also, we want to specify whether we want our server to be running over UDP or TCP. We want to actually run a full TCP three-way handshake connection with the TCP protocol. So in order to specify that, we need to just type socket.sock_stream, and we successfully created our socket object. So once again, this stands for IPv4 connection and this stands for TCP connection. So in the next line, we will set some of the options for our socket object. In order to do that, we will use a function called setSockOpt, and in the actual brackets just specify socket.so_socket, comma, socket.so_reuse addr. After that, comma 1, and that is all we need to do for our socket object in the entire program. We set some of the options, we also created the socket, and right now we are going to run our next function, which is actually the function that we saw in the previous theory video where we actually explained what we need to run in order to perform the connection, and that function is actually called bind. So if you just type s.bind, what this function does, what this function does is it will bind your IP address, your local IP address, to the actual port that you specify in between these brackets. So what you need to specify right here is the IP address of your Kali Linux machine, and also to specify the port that you want to bind to that IP address. Now make sure before you specify anything that you make sure that that port is not used by anything else, otherwise this won't work. That's why I always like to use some high port, for example 54321, because I know that most likely none programs will be running on that port. Also, the bind function takes the arguments between the double open and close brackets, so make sure to specify double open and double close brackets, and in between there, first of all, you specify between the double quotes the IP address. So in order to specify our IP address, we first of all need to check it, run ifconfig, we can copy our local IP address, nano back to our server, and paste it between the double quotes. Right after that, we need to separate comma, and add the port that we want to bind to, in my case 54321. So after that, we need to listen for the incoming connection. So now that we created the socket object and that we binded our port to our IP address, we need to listen for the incoming connections. In order to do that, we need to specify the listen function, and in between to how many connections we want to listen for. For example, specify 5. You can even use 1 for this actual test, but 5 will do the same job as well. After that, we can actually print a few statements which will allow us to know whether we completed these statements right here correctly, or whether we ran into some error. So let us print the successful execution in red, in green, and the failed attempts in red. So from term color import colored. So what we are going to do is right here we can print colored, and then let me just, okay, so we need to specify plus, since this means that it worked. Listening for incoming connections. So make sure to close two brackets, and then after that, since we know that we are now listening for the connections, we need to specify two variables where we will store the actual connection. So one of them will be the target, and one of them will be the IP address, which we will use as a string in a later program. So what this means, the socket object we are going to store in the target, which will store it somewhere in the memory, and the IP address or the IP variable will store the IP address and the port from where the connection is coming from, which then we will use this IP variable in order to print from where we got the connection. So we can just type here s.accept, since we are accepting to our socket object, and we can see print, and we can print colored connection established from, and then we can use %s, since we are going to specify a string, and we can just close the double quotes and here use %string from IP. Make sure to close 1, 2, 3, and or just 3 actual brackets. So I hope, let me just count. So we got 1, 2, 3 open and 3 closed. Okay, so everything is good enough, and basically this is the entire program for actually creating the server side of the connection. So for what we are going to do in the next video is we are going to code the reverse shell part, which will only consist of the connect function, and then we will test if our program can actually connect to our server. So let us just save this, and we will continue in the next lecture with our reverse shell. So hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I hope I see you in the next lecture. Bye!